Welcome back, this is episode number 2 of this tutorial series on Raspberry Pi for complete beginners. You can find the series playlist link in the description. And let's get started. The very first step before using the Pi is to flash an operating system on the SD card you have and do some configuration. In this lesson, I will show you how you can easily install the Raspberry Pi OS on your micro SD card, but also how to set up the Wi-Fi and an SSH connection so we can get access to the Raspberry Pi. So you can start by going on Google and just type Raspberry Pi and go to raspberrypi.com. So raspberrypi.com and then just go to software here. So you should have raspberrypi.com/software. And we are going to download and install the Raspberry Pi imager here. So what is this? This is actually a software you can install on Windows, macOS and also Linux. And this will allow you to easily flash the operating system, so the Raspberry Pi operating system, into your SD card. So click on whatever operating system you have right now. Okay, I am running Windows, so I'm gonna download it for Windows. Then you can wait a few seconds. Okay, and when you have the installer, you can just run the installer. Maybe it will ask you to confirm, so I'm clicking on yes if you have a pop-up on Windows. And then, well, let's install the Raspberry Pi imager on the computer. So click on install, and that's pretty much it. So now you wait a bit. Okay, and let's finish. So you can run it directly or not. So let's finish the installation. And if you want to run it, well, you can just go on the Windows button here or just press the Windows key and search for Raspberry Pi and you will find the Raspberry Pi imager here on the applications. So if you have another pop-up, you click on yes to allow the software to run on Windows and then you will get this software here. So make sure that here I have version 1.7. Okay, make sure that you have at least 1.7. It can be a higher version, but no lower than 1.7. So if you already have this installed and it's not 1.7, just remove the software and reinstall it by downloading the latest version. Now, well, what you can do is you can take your micro SD card and put the micro SD card on your computer. So I just did that, and well, maybe you will have some file manager that opens. You can just close everything and then you're gonna here click on choose operating system. And you're gonna choose the latest operating system here. So the first one on the top. Then you click on choose storage and it should automatically detect the SD card that you have put. So here I have a 16 GB SD card. So I click on this. And then, well, before you click on write, what we're gonna do is we're gonna click on this settings button. And we are going to configure actually SSH and the Wi-Fi and a few other things before we write the operating system. And this again, if you don't have this, is because you maybe have a version that is not 1.7. Okay, so if you have an earlier version, please download the new one because you would not have this option, these settings. So what do we do on this menu? You're gonna click on enable SSH and leave it like this. Okay, we're gonna use SSH to get access to the Raspberry Pi using the terminal, and I'm gonna show you that just a bit later. And from this, we will be able to configure everything, for example, get access to a remote desktop, etc. So you click on enable SSH, and then you have set username and password. So you can keep Pi, okay, this is like the default username for Raspberry Pi. You can keep this or choose anything else, but I'm gonna keep Pi, and then you set a password. So just any password you want. This is going to be the password for the user named Pi. Okay, so make sure that you, of course, type the correct password and that you remember it. And then you go down and you're gonna configure the Wi-Fi connection. And so here, well, if you are already connected, so I'm gonna check here and you can see that my computer is already connected to a network, so a Wi-Fi network called your Wi-Fi network. So this is actually a hotspot I have made from my phone, okay, and I have named it your Wi-Fi network so it's easier for this lesson. And if you look at show password, so it should automatically put the name, so the SSID and the password. So I have set your Wi-Fi network as the name and your password as the password. So of course, make sure that you use the correct Wi-Fi name and the correct password, because that's not going to be the same for you. Okay, so make sure you use the same one that your computer is connected to. That's super, super important, because if your computer and your Raspberry Pi are not connected to the same Wi-Fi network, then they won't be able to find each other. Okay, so once you have configured the Wi-Fi, you go down, and then you're gonna also do this set local settings. And so you can choose your time zone. So for me, it's Europe, Paris for France, and then a keyboard layout. So if you have a QWERTY keyboard, you keep US, but for me, I'm gonna go to FR because I have a French keyboard. So make sure that you use the keyboard layout that corresponds to your actual keyboard. And then that's pretty much it. So to recap, we have enable SSH, set username and password with a custom password here and username Pi, and then click on setup, so configure Wi-Fi, put the correct name and password, the same as your computer is connected to, and then set local with the time zone and the keyboard layout. You can click on save, and then all you need to do is click on write, and you have a pop-up here. All existing data will be erased. Okay, so make sure that what you had previously on the SD card is not something you want to keep, because that's gonna be completely erased and the operating system is gonna take all the space on the SD card. So are you sure you want to continue? Yes. And then you can wait. So that's gonna take a few minutes, okay, to write the operating system on the SD card. Okay, and after a few minutes, you should see this pop-up, write successful, which means that the Raspberry Pi operating system has been downloaded, has been written to your SD card, and everything worked correctly. So you can click on continue, and now, well, congratulations, you have installed Raspberry Pi operating system on the SD card. On boot, your Raspberry Pi should automatically try to connect to the Wi-Fi network you've provided. And also SSH will be automatically enabled, which will help us in the next step. So now what we are going to do is to boot the Raspberry Pi. And before you do that, make sure that the Raspberry Pi is powered off, okay, and that nothing is connected to it. No cable, nothing. This is very important. So you can take the SD card out of your computer and just plug it to the SD card slot of the Raspberry Pi, just like you see on the photo. Then once the SD card is correctly plugged, you can power it on. Okay, and to power on the Raspberry Pi, make sure that you use a good power supply with at least 5 volt and 2 amps. Okay, you can use an official Raspberry Pi adapter or even a recent phone charger. One thing to make sure is don't power your Raspberry Pi from the laptop directly. Okay, the current may be too low and you will have some problems later on. So when you boot the Raspberry Pi, you will see first a red LED powered on, and then the green LED should blink randomly. If the blink LED blinks randomly, this is actually a good sign. It means that the Raspberry Pi is booting. And after a few seconds, maybe 1 or 2 minutes stop, the Raspberry Pi should be connected to your Wi-Fi network, and this is where we're gonna go to the next step and find the Raspberry Pi IP address on the network. What is the current state now? You have this computer right here that is connected to the Wi-Fi network. So here for me, it's your Wi-Fi network. Then you have also the Raspberry Pi, which has boot and is connected to the Wi-Fi network. But to be able to connect to it, you need to know what is the Raspberry Pi IP address. So first, how to find the Raspberry Pi IP address. So there are many ways to do this, but one way is to use a software that's gonna scan the network and find the IP addresses on the network. And the one I'm gonna use here is Angry IP Scanner, okay? And why I use it? Because it's multi-platform. You can use it on Windows, macOS, and also Linux. So you just type Angry IP Scanner and you go to here angryip.org. You can go to Downloads, and then you can see you have either the Windows version, the macOS, or Linux. So here, of course, I'm on Windows, so I'm gonna click here on Windows Installer. But before, let's see quickly on macOS. So if you are on macOS, you will need to install the Angry IP Scanner bundle here, and then right-click and open. Okay, and before that, you will make sure that you have Java installed, and so you can click on Java here. And well, this is going to install Java, so you can click on download now and just select, well, the version you have, so macOS. This is the same if you are using Linux, okay? So you can just download with the current version you have, standard JDK, and just download from here and install it. And the same for Linux. And now that you have Java, you can so click here, or on Linux you can also download the package that you want. If you are on Windows it's even better because the installer already includes Java runtime, so you don't even need to install Java on the side. So I'm gonna click on Windows installer, and then you wait that the download is finished, and you can click on the installer. So maybe you have a pop-up, you click on yes, you click on next, and then you just choose the path, or you just leave it like this and click on install and just wait a few seconds. All right, now you click on finish, and you can just search on the Windows bar or on the application menu for Angry IP Scanner. You launch it, and okay, you click on next, 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 and close. Well, that doesn't really matter. And so you will have this interface. And once again, before I even start to do anything here, go back to Wi-Fi settings and make sure that your computer is on the same Wi-Fi network that you have set for your Raspberry Pi. This is super, super important, because if you're not on the same network, you just can't find the Raspberry Pi. And now let's see how to configure this so we can find the Raspberry Pi IP address. So what do we have here? We will be able to scan, when we click on the start button, to scan a range in the network, so in the Wi-Fi network, and we're going to have different IPs, the ping, the hostname, etc. So the IP address will be all the IP address that we try, and then if we find something, so if there is a host, okay, if there is, for example, a laptop or a Raspberry Pi or anything else, we will find it and we will have a ping, which means like how long did it take to ping or to get access to the host. And then you have the host name, so that can be Raspberry Pi, that can be your laptop name, etc. The thing is that with Raspberry Pi, sometimes here with Angry IP Scanner, you will not see host name. So we will click on this icon here, and on the right, you will look for Mac vendor and click on the left button to add it and click on OK. So now we have Mac vendor. So that will allow us to know for sure that we have found the Raspberry Pi. Okay, so the next thing to do is, so here we have host name. You can see this is the host name that corresponds to this computer right here. Okay, so for you it's gonna be different, of course. And then you click on IP here. And well, you may have just a few or a lot. It depends. For me, I have a lot of things because I have some virtual machines running, but you will find something like Wi-Fi. So maybe it's not the same thing, but find a line that looks like Wi-Fi and that has an address like this, that starts by 192.168. Okay, if you have this, then that's a good start. You may also have something that starts with 10.0. Okay, that's also valid. That's like a local network. And so, well, try to find the line that corresponds to what I have here on my computer. So I click on this. And then you can see the IP range now is 192.168.31.0 to, well, the same first three numbers and 255. So if you don't have this, you just delete and you put 0 at the end, and here you put 255. Okay, so this, the first three numbers actually correspond to the network, okay? So the current network has a name, but also has an IP address, which is 192.168.31. And then all the addresses here in the network. And you have actually 256 possibilities from 0 to 255. Actually, this one is the network when it finishes with 0, and 255 is called also the broadcast address. And so what it's gonna do, it's gonna scan everything between the 0 and 255, and the Raspberry Pi should, of course, be somewhere between those two IP addresses in this network. So once you have this, and of course that the Raspberry Pi has already boot, so make sure that you have boot the Raspberry Pi for at least 1 or 2 minutes for the first boot, because it can take some time to connect to your Wi-Fi network. Then you can click on Start, and you're gonna wait for a few seconds. Okay, if you have that kind of alert, you click on Allow Access, of course. Okay, and you can see scanning completed in 37 seconds, so it can take more or less time, it depends. Well, you click on Close, and then, well, so if it's red, it means that nothing has been found. If it's blue, something has been found. But let's actually click on Ping and sort by ping. Okay, and you can see that, well, we have the Raspberry Pi here. So what happened here is that we found 3 IP addresses, okay? This one corresponds to actually this computer, so of course it's gonna be found. And then we have something else here and something else here. And you can see we have a host name, raspberrypi.local, and we also have Mac vendor Raspberry Pi trading. So if you find one of those two, you know that you have found the Raspberry Pi. And what is the IP address of the Raspberry Pi? Well, this is the IP address here. So for me, that's 192.168.31.76. And of course, it's going to be different for you. What we can do now is to use SSH to take control over the Raspberry Pi and really get access to it. And the first thing you can do is open a file manager, okay, and go to your users. So I'm going to go to users and then my user, okay. Here you may find a folder named .ssh. So if you don't have all the dot folders, those are actually hidden folders. So you can go on View, Show, and then Hidden Items. Make sure that you check that box. And so you can find the .ssh. If you can still see all the other dots, so maybe not the same as me, but if you can find other hidden folders here, but not the .ssh, then that's fine. You don't need to do anything. But if you see the .ssh, you go here, and you may have a non-host file. So maybe yes, maybe not. But if you have one, you're gonna just delete it. Okay, that step is just in case we have some trouble connecting. And now, well, you can close the file manager and you can open a terminal. So how to open a terminal, or in other words, the command line tool on Windows? Well, you just open the Windows menu here and you can type CMD, for example, and you can open command prompt and you will get something like this. So I will zoom in with Control and the mouse here. Great. Just a bit more. And if you are on macOS, you can also search for command line. And if you are on Linux, well, I probably guess that if you are on Linux, you know how to open a terminal. So once you have the terminal, whether it is macOS, Linux, or Windows, you have the SSH command. So if you just type SSH and you press enter, you should have something like this. Usage SSH. So basically that's kind of a help for SSH. If you don't have this, okay, if you have SSH command not found or something like that on Windows, well, you can go on a web browser and you can search for Putty. So P-U-T-T-Y, and this is an SSH client, okay, that you can download. So you can just download. Okay, so you download the installer here and you just install it, and you can then use it to connect to SSH to the Raspberry Pi using a graphical interface. But this is just in case that SSH doesn't work on your Windows. For example, if you have an old version of Windows that is lower than Windows 10, you will not have SSH by default. Alright, so coming back to the terminal, how do we get access to the Raspberry Pi? Well, you will put the SSH command and then space, and then you need to provide the username with which you want to connect to the Pi. And so what is the username? Well, if you remember in the lesson where we actually flashed the operating system into the SD card, we had to specify a username and a password. And the username I have specified was Pi. So if you have provided a different username, make sure you use the different username here. Okay? So you put the username and then you put @ and then we need to put the IP address. So what is the IP address? Well, the IP address is the one you have found here with Angry IP Scanner. So 192.168.31.76. So I put it here, 192.168.31.76. And make sure that you double check that this is the same that you are using here. So once you have this SSH space username at IP address, you can press enter. And you will see this. So are you sure you want to continue? Yes, no. So you just type yes and you press enter. And now you can see that it's asking for the password. And so what is the password? Well, the password is the one you have provided also when you were flashing the operating system. So you had to provide a username, which was pi or something else, and you had to provide a password. So here you're gonna type the exact same password. And this is very important. If the password doesn't work here and you get a password denied or something like this, it's just because you have put a wrong password during the installation. So you need to go back to flashing the SD card and make sure that you use the correct password. So I press enter. Okay, you should not see, when you type the password, you should not see anything. You just type the password and you press enter. And now you can see if you've put the correct password. Now we are actually in the Raspberry Pi. So we are still in the terminal, but the terminal is now connected to the Raspberry Pi via SSH, and we are actually inside the Pi, so we have access to the Raspberry Pi. And you can see here we have the user Pi, and the host is also named Raspberry Pi. Alright, that's the end of this episode. If you found it useful, you will definitely like my full complete course on Raspberry Pi named Raspberry Pi for Beginners. This course contains 10 hours of hands-on video lessons. You can find the link in the description. Thank you for watching, see you in the course or in the next tutorial of the series.